A Continent Under Crown Rule, 1763. The year 1763 arrived not with celebration, but with quiet transformation. Across the vast American colonies, church bells rang in thanksgiving for Britain's triumph in the French and Indian War. Flags bearing the Union Jack fluttered in colonial ports from Boston to Charleston, and official proclamations declared the British Empire stronger than it had ever been. France, long a rival in North America, had been decisively defeated. Canada, the Ohio Valley, and immense stretches of land beyond the Appalachian Mountains now belonged to the British Crown. Yet beneath the surface of victory, something uneasy began to take root. For ordinary colonists, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, sailors, and frontiersmen, the war's end did not feel like triumph. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter. British victory had reshaped the political map of the continent, but it also reshaped daily life in ways few had anticipated. The empire that colonists once saw as a distant protector now loomed closer than ever, its authority pressing down upon them. Before 1763, many American colonists had lived with a sense of relative freedom. Britain's attention had been divided by wars in Europe, allowing colonial assemblies to govern local affairs with minimal interference. Taxes were light, enforcement was lax, and life, though harsh and labor-intensive, followed rhythms set more by nature than by Parliament. Colonists considered themselves loyal British subjects, but they were also fiercely independent, shaped by frontier living and self-reliance. The French and Indian War changed everything. Britain emerged victorious, but deeply in debt. Protecting newly conquered territories required standing armies, fortifications, and administration. British officials in London looked across the Atlantic and saw the colonies not just as communities of subjects, but as assets that must now help pay the cost of empire. The logic seemed simple to Parliament. The war had been fought, in large part, to protect American colonists. Therefore, Americans should bear part of the financial burden. To the colonists, however, this reasoning felt dangerously unfamiliar. In the months following the war, British soldiers did not leave North America. Instead, red-coated regiments remained stationed in colonial towns and along the frontier. For the first time, many Americans lived under the constant presence of a standing army during peacetime. Soldiers were quartered in cities, marched through villages, and guarded ports. What Britain viewed as protection, colonists increasingly perceived as occupation. The Crown also issued the Proclamation of 1763, drawing a boundary along the Appalachian Mountains and forbidding colonial settlement westward. To British officials, the proclamation was a practical measure designed to prevent costly conflicts with Native American tribes. To colonists, especially those who had fought and bled during the war, it felt like betrayal. Veterans and land speculators had dreamed of Western lands as rewards for their service. Now those promises seemed hollow. Resentment spread quietly, carried in conversations at taverns, around hearth fires, and across trading docks. Merchants felt the pressure first. British trade laws, once loosely enforced, were now applied with new seriousness. Customs officials inspected ships more rigorously, seized goods, and demanded paperwork. Smuggling, once an open secret, became a dangerous gamble. For colonial traders, these changes threatened livelihoods built over generations. What had once been flexible arrangements were now rigid rules enforced in the name of imperial control. Farmers, too, sensed a shift. Prices fluctuated as markets tightened, and new regulations made it harder to sell goods freely. Frontier families, already accustomed to hardship, felt hemmed in by distant decisions made by men who had never set foot on American soil. To them, London might as well have been another world. Yet perhaps the most profound change was psychological. Before 1763, many colonists believed the British system worked in their favor. They saw themselves as partners in a shared imperial project. After the war, that belief began to crack. Policies increasingly arrived from overseas with no colonial input. Decisions that shaped daily life were made in Parliament where Americans had no elected representatives. The phrase, "subjects of the Crown," took on a sharper edge. Still, resistance did not come immediately. Most colonists did not dream of rebellion. They asked only for fairness, respect, and a continuation of the freedoms they believed were their birthright as Englishmen. Letters were written, petitions were drafted, colonial assemblies voiced concerns in measured tones. Loyalty remained strong, but trust had begun to erode. British officials misread this tension. From London's perspective, the colonies had grown prosperous and complacent. They needed firmer guidance, clearer rules, and stronger oversight. Empire, after all, required order. What officials failed to understand was how deeply independence had already shaped colonial identity. Generations of self-governance had taught Americans to question authority that felt distant and unaccountable. As the years passed, small grievances accumulated. None alone seemed capable of tearing an empire apart. Together, they formed a pattern, one that ordinary Americans began to recognize. The Crown's authority was no longer abstract. It touched their wallets, their land, their movement, and their sense of dignity. In quiet moments, colonists began to ask dangerous questions. Why should a parliament across the ocean decide their fate? Why should soldiers patrol streets that had known peace? Why should victory in war feel like loss in peace? These questions did not have answers, but they lingered, whispered rather than shouted, carried from colony to colony, like embers waiting for a spark. The year 1763 did not mark the birth of revolution, but it marked the moment when the ground beneath British rule began to shift. The continent was still under the Crown. The Union Jack still flew above forts and harbors. Loyalty still outweighed defiance. Taxed without a voice. In the years following 1763, the tension that had quietly settled over the American colonies began to harden into something sharper. What had once been distant unease now entered homes, shops, courts, and printing presses. The British Empire, burdened by war debt and convinced of its authority, turned toward a solution that seemed logical in London but deeply unjust in America: taxes. To Parliament, taxation was a simple matter of responsibility. Britain had spent enormous sums defending the colonies during the French and Indian War. Soldiers, supplies, and naval power had ensured American safety and territorial expansion. In return, British leaders believed the colonies should contribute directly to imperial finances. For the first time, revenue would be raised not merely to regulate trade, but to extract money from colonial pockets. The first shock came in 1765 with the passage of the Stamp Act. Unlike earlier duties placed on imported goods, the Stamp Act reached into the everyday lives of ordinary Americans. It required that printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, licenses, pamphlets, even playing cards, carry an official government stamp, purchased with hard currency. To British lawmakers, the tax seemed modest. To colonists, it felt invasive, unavoidable, and profoundly symbolic. Every contract, every court case, every newspaper now carried the weight of Parliament's authority. Lawyers protested immediately. Without stamped paper, courts could not legally function. Printers feared ruin, knowing their readership would collapse under increased costs. Merchants worried the trade would slow as paperwork multiplied. Even farmers, who rarely dealt with legal documents, sensed the danger.
If Parliament could tax paper today, what would stop it from taxing land, crops, or labor tomorrow? What angered colonists most was not simply the cost, but the principle. Americans had no representatives in Parliament. They had no voice in debates that shaped their lives. British officials insisted that the colonies were virtually represented, meaning Parliament acted in their best interest, regardless of colonial input. To Americans, this argument rang hollow. Representation, they believed, required consent. Without it, taxation became an act of power rather than law. From this belief emerged a phrase that would echo through history: no taxation without representation. Resistance took many forms. In colonial assemblies, resolutions were passed declaring the Stamp Act unconstitutional. In taverns and town squares, speeches stirred crowds. Pamphlets flooded the streets, arguing that Englishmen could not be taxed by a body in which they had no voice. The Sons of Liberty, a loosely organized group of merchants, artisans, and laborers, began to organize protests, some peaceful, others violent. Stamp distributors were threatened, harassed, and forced to resign. Effigies were hung from trees. British authority, once distant and unquestioned, became a visible target of colonial anger. For many Americans, this was their first taste of collective resistance. The economic consequences were immediate. Colonists responded with boycotts of British goods. Merchants refused to import taxed items, striking at the heart of British commerce. British manufacturers, feeling the impact of lost markets, pressured Parliament to reconsider. By 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed. Celebrations erupted across the colonies. Bells rang, bonfires burned, and loyalty to the Crown briefly resurfaced. Yet beneath the relief lay a deeper unease. Parliament had repealed the tax, but it had also passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to tax and legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The message was clear. The struggle was not over. In 1767, Parliament tried again, this time with the Townshend Acts. Rather than direct internal taxes, these acts placed duties on imported goods such as glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. British officials hoped this approach would be more acceptable, framing the taxes as trade regulations rather than revenue measures. The proceeds would be used to pay colonial governors and judges, making them independent of colonial assemblies and firmly loyal to the Crown. To Americans, this change struck at the foundation of self-government. If officials no longer depended on colonial approval for their salaries, how could colonists hold them accountable? Courts, once symbols of local justice, now appeared as instruments of imperial control. Once again, economic policy revealed deeper political consequences. Resistance reignited, stronger and more organized than before. Women played a critical role, forming groups that produced homespun cloth to replace British textiles. Newspapers published essays questioning Parliament's authority. Colonial merchants renewed boycotts, turning economic protest into a powerful weapon. For ordinary families, resistance became a daily act, choosing what to buy, what to wear, and where to stand. British troops were sent to enforce order, particularly in Boston, where resistance was strongest. Streets filled with suspicion. Insults turned into confrontations. Authority, once abstract, now marched in uniform. Economic pressure tightened on all sides. Colonial merchants struggled under disrupted trade. British officials faced mounting defiance. Workers lost jobs as commerce slowed. Yet instead of dividing the colonies, hardship forged a shared sense of injustice. From New England ports to southern plantations, colonists recognized a common threat to their autonomy. The bond between Britain and its colonies, once built on mutual benefit, now appeared fragile. Parliament viewed resistance as ingratitude. Colonists viewed taxation as tyranny. Each believed it defended fairness and order. Neither fully understood the other. What began as a financial dispute evolved into a moral argument, one about rights, power, and the meaning of liberty. By the early 1770s, most Townshend duties were repealed, except for the tax on tea. Parliament hoped this concession would restore calm. Instead, it left behind a dangerous precedent. Britain had taxed without consent, enforced obedience with soldiers, and dismissed colonial voices. The damage was done. Americans had learned that resistance could succeed, but also that the Crown would not easily surrender control. Trust, once broken, proved difficult to restore. The question was no longer whether Parliament had the right to tax, but whether it had the right to rule at all. The colonies were still British. Loyalty still existed, but the illusion of harmony had faded. Economic pressure revealed political truth. Ordinary Americans, once content to live under distant authority, now understood the cost of silence.
As the clash between Parliament and the American colonies deepened, resistance found new paths of expression, quiet, intimate, and often hidden in plain sight. Laws could be repealed and taxes adjusted, but ideas, once awakened, were far more difficult to silence. Across towns, farms, and bustling ports, revolutionary thought spread not through armies or proclamations, but through whispers shared in taverns and sermons delivered from pulpits. These were the meeting places of colonial America, the spaces where ordinary people gathered not as subjects, but as neighbors. Taverns stood at the heart of colonial life. More than places to drink, they were hubs of information, debate, and decision-making. Merchants negotiated deals, sailors shared news from distant ports, farmers discussed prices and weather, and travelers carried stories from colony to colony. In a world without instant communication, taverns served as informal newspapers, alive with rumor and opinion. As British authority tightened, taverns became incubators of dissent. Men gathered around rough wooden tables, lowering their voices as conversations turned from trade to politics. Pamphlets passed from hand to hand. Newspapers were read aloud for those who could not read. News of boycotts in Boston, speeches in Virginia, and protests in New York traveled rapidly through these networks. Though separated by distance, colonists began to feel connected by shared grievances. The revolution, in its earliest form, was spoken before it was written. Pamphlets played a crucial role in this transformation. Cheap to print and easy to distribute, they carried ideas beyond elite circles and into the hands of artisans, laborers, and farmers. Writers challenged the authority of Parliament, questioned the nature of representation, and explored the meaning of liberty. Some argued in legal terms, others in emotional appeals, but all shared a common goal: to awaken awareness. One pamphlet might be read aloud in a tavern, discussed heatedly, then carried by a traveler to the next town. Another might find its way into a farmhouse, where it was read by candlelight and debated around the dinner table. Literacy varied, but ideas did not depend on reading alone. They traveled through conversation, repetition, and belief. Churches, too, became powerful platforms for change. For generations, the pulpit had shaped colonial values, teaching obedience, morality, and community responsibility. Now, many ministers began to reinterpret Scripture in light of current events. They spoke of tyranny and righteousness, of unjust rulers and the duty to resist oppression.
Biblical stories of deliverance resonated deeply with congregations who felt increasingly burdened by imperial control. A sermon could transform political protest into moral obligation. Ministers reminded their listeners that liberty was not merely a privilege granted by kings, but a gift from God. If rulers violated divine principles of justice, resistance became not only acceptable, but necessary. These sermons reached far beyond city centers. In rural parishes and frontier churches, farmers and laborers heard messages that framed their struggles in sacred terms. Faith and freedom became intertwined. Secret meetings emerged alongside public discourse. Groups such as the Sons of Liberty met in back rooms, warehouses, and private homes. They planned protests, organized boycotts, and coordinated communication across colonies. Their methods were discreet, but their influence was growing. Symbols, signals, and coded language allowed members to recognize one another while avoiding British scrutiny. Women, often excluded from formal political life, became essential participants in this underground movement. In homes and marketplaces, they discussed politics, supported boycotts, and organized local efforts to produce goods domestically. Their choices, what to buy, what to wear, what to refuse, carried political meaning. Resistance entered daily life through ordinary decisions. Ports played a unique role in spreading revolutionary ideas. Sailors arrived with news from across the Atlantic. They brought stories of debates in Parliament, unrest in other colonies, and shifting political alliances. Docks buzzed with information. Ships carried not only goods, but ideas, connecting Boston to Charleston, Philadelphia to New York. The Atlantic world shrank as communication intensified. In these ports, colonial identity began to evolve. People who once identified primarily as Virginians, New Yorkers, or Massachusetts men began to recognize common cause. British policies did not target one colony alone. They affected all. Shared resistance created shared identity. The phrase American took on new meaning, no longer merely geographical, but political. British authorities underestimated this transformation. Officials believed loyalty could be restored through enforcement and concessions. They failed to grasp the power of informal networks. Ideas moved faster than soldiers. You could seize a shipment of pamphlets, but not the thoughts already planted in minds. You could silence a printer, but not the conversations echoing in taverns and churches. Fear spread alongside hope. Some colonists worried that resistance invited chaos. They feared violence, economic ruin, and divine punishment. Families were divided. Friends argued. Communities struggled to balance loyalty and liberty. The revolution was not unanimous. It was contested, uncertain, and deeply human. Yet even doubt served a purpose. Debate sharpened ideas. Disagreement forced clarity. Through argument and reflection, colonists refined their understanding of rights and responsibilities. Political awareness grew not only through conviction, but through conflict. By the early 1770s, revolutionary thought had reached even the most remote corners of colonial society. A farmer in the backcountry could articulate grievances once discussed only in elite circles. A sailor could quote pamphlets he had never read. A churchgoer could connect scripture to political action. The colonies were awakening. This awakening did not yet demand independence. Many still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, but the mental distance between ruler and ruled had widened. Authority was no longer assumed, it was questioned. Obedience was no longer automatic, it was conditional. The whispers had become louder. From taverns thick with smoke to churches filled with prayer, a shared language of resistance emerged. It crossed class lines, geographic boundaries, and religious differences. It bound strangers together through shared belief. A colonial identity was being born, not in grand halls or battlefields, but in everyday spaces where ordinary people dared to speak, listen, and imagine a different future.
By the winter of 1770, Boston had become a city on edge. Narrow streets echoed with tension, and the cold air carried more than the promise of snow. It carried resentment, fear, and anger. British soldiers had occupied the city for over a year, sent to enforce imperial authority and protect customs officials. To the Crown, they were guardians of order. To many Bostonians, they were a constant reminder of lost liberty. The presence of redcoats changed daily life. Soldiers competed with local laborers for work, driving down wages. They patrolled streets where neighbors once walked freely. Their uniforms, bright against the gray winter landscape, symbolized power imposed rather than welcomed. Encounters between civilians and soldiers grew frequent and rarely friendly. Insults were exchanged, fights broke out, trust evaporated. Boston was no longer just a port city, it was a powder keg. On the evening of March 5, 1770, the city lay under a blanket of snow. The cold was sharp, and darkness settled early. What began as a small confrontation soon spiraled into one of the most defining moments in American colonial history. Outside the customs house on King Street, a lone British sentry stood guard. A group of colonists, many of them dock workers and apprentices, began to gather. Words were exchanged, angry, mocking, and defiant. Snowballs packed with ice and debris flew through the air. Church bells rang, not for worship, but as alarms, drawing more people into the street. The crowd grew louder. The soldier grew nervous. Reinforcements arrived. 8 British soldiers led by Captain Thomas Preston. Muskets were loaded. The line between authority and chaos blurred. In the flickering light of street lamps, fear took hold on both sides. Colonists shouted insults, daring the soldiers to fire. Soldiers tightened their grips, uncertain and exposed. Then, in a moment that would be argued over for generations, a shot rang out. Whether it was an accident or a command misunderstood, the sound shattered the night. More shots followed in rapid succession. Smoke filled the air. When the echoes faded, 5 colonists lay dead or dying on the blood-stained snow. Crispus Attucks, a dock worker of African and Native American descent, fell first. Others followed: Samuel Gray, Samuel Maverick, James Caldwell, and Patrick Carr. They were ordinary men, caught in extraordinary circumstances. Their deaths transformed a tense confrontation into a symbol of oppression. The city erupted in shock. Word spread quickly throughout Boston and beyond. Bells rang again, this time in mourning. Crowds gathered. Fear turned into fury. British soldiers were arrested, an extraordinary act that signaled how fragile authority had become. Governor Thomas Hutchinson struggled to restore calm, ordering troops to withdraw from the city center. Yet calm was an illusion. What truly followed was a battle for meaning. Almost immediately, competing narratives emerged. British officials described the incident as self-defense, a necessary response to a violent mob. Colonists described it as a massacre, an unprovoked slaughter of innocent civilians. The truth lay tangled in fear, confusion, and human error, but perception mattered more than precision. Patriot leaders understood this instinctively. Paul Revere's engraving of the event spread rapidly through the colonies. It depicted disciplined soldiers firing into a helpless crowd, blood pooling dramatically in the snow. The image was not entirely accurate, but it was powerful. It turned a chaotic moment into a clear moral story,
one of victims and villains. Pamphlets, sermons, and newspapers amplified the message. The Boston Massacre became proof in the minds of many Americans that British soldiers were not protectors but oppressors. The presence of a standing army during peacetime now seemed not merely unnecessary but dangerous. If soldiers could fire on civilians in Boston, they could do so anywhere. Even those who had remained neutral began to question their loyalties. Yet the aftermath revealed another complexity. When the soldiers were put on trial, colonial leaders insisted on fairness. John Adams, a future president and committed patriot, agreed to defend the accused soldiers. He believed that justice, not revenge, must guide the colonial cause. The trial captivated the public. Witnesses testified. Conflicting accounts were heard. Fear, provocation, and confusion were laid bare. In the end, most of the soldiers were acquitted. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter and branded on the thumb, a punishment lighter than many had expected. To Adams, the verdict proved that colonial society upheld the rule of law. To others, it underscored how dangerous the situation had become, how easily blood could be spilled, and how fragile peace truly was. The victims, however, were not forgotten. Funerals turned into political demonstrations. Thousands marched through Boston's streets in solemn procession. The dead were honored as martyrs. Their names were spoken alongside calls for liberty. Grief became fuel for resistance. Across the colonies, the story took root. In towns far from Boston, people discussed the massacre in taverns and churches. Sermons framed it as a warning. Pamphlets used it as evidence. Parents told their children about the night when soldiers fired on civilians. The event entered collective memory, shaping how Americans viewed British authority. Parliament, watching from afar, misunderstood the depth of the reaction. Officials believed order had been restored. Troops were reduced. Tensions seemed to ease. But beneath the surface, something irreversible had occurred. The image of the British soldier had changed forever. He was no longer simply a symbol of imperial strength. He was a reminder of blood on the snow. The Boston Massacre did not start the American Revolution, but it hardened attitudes. It clarified fears. It drew emotional lines that could not easily be erased. Violence, once theoretical, had become real. Ordinary Americans had seen the cost of imperial control in human lives. From that winter night forward, reconciliation became harder to imagine. Trust, already weakened, shattered further. The question was no longer whether British policies were unjust, but whether British rule itself was incompatible with liberty. The snow eventually melted. Streets were cleaned. Life resumed its rhythms. But the memory remained, frozen in time, stained with blood, and etched into the conscience of a people moving steadily toward revolution.
By the early 1770s, the American colonies existed in a state of uneasy calm. The violence of the Boston Massacre had faded into memory, yet its emotional impact lingered like a wound that refused to heal. British troops had withdrawn from the heart of Boston, and Parliament had repealed most of the Townshend duties. To officials in London, these actions signaled compromise and restored order. To many Americans, they signaled something else entirely: calculation. One tax remained: the duty on tea. Tea was not a luxury in colonial America. It was a daily ritual. Families gathered around it in the morning and evening. Taverns served it alongside rum. Conversations unfolded over steaming cups. By leaving the tea tax in place, Parliament was making a deliberate statement. It was not about money, it was about authority. If Americans accepted the tea tax, they accepted Parliament's right to tax them without consent. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act,
a law intended to rescue the struggling British East India Company. The act allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a lower price, undercutting colonial merchants and smugglers. Ironically, the tea would be cheaper than before, even with the tax included. British officials assumed the logic was unassailable. Why would colonists protest cheaper tea? But they misunderstood the depth of colonial resistance. To Americans, the Tea Act was not a bargain, it was a trap. By purchasing the tea, colonists would be silently agreeing to Parliament's authority. The issue was no longer economic, it was philosophical. Liberty, many believed, could not be discounted. Across the colonies, opposition rose swiftly. Ships carrying East India Company tea were turned away from ports. In New York and Philadelphia, crowds refused to allow the tea to be unloaded. In Charleston, the tea was seized and stored, never sold. Resistance was coordinated, deliberate, and increasingly confident. Boston, however, stood at the center of the storm. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, loyal to the Crown and determined to enforce the law, refused to back down. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, sat anchored in Boston Harbor, their holds filled with tea. Hutchinson insisted the tea be unloaded and the tax paid. Patriot leaders insisted the ships leave without unloading. For weeks, the city waited. Meetings were held daily, drawing thousands of citizens. The Old South Meeting House overflowed with men debating the fate of the tea. Voices rose, tempers flared. Outside, the harbor lay frozen under the grip of winter, its dark waters reflecting the uncertainty of the moment. The deadline approached. By law, if the tea was not unloaded, customs officials could seize it. On the evening of December 16, 1773, the decision was made. As dusk fell, a signal passed quietly through the crowd. Men disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, not to mock native peoples, but to symbolize an American identity separate from Britain. Faces were darkened, blankets were wrapped around shoulders. Ordinary citizens transformed themselves into symbols. They moved with purpose toward Griffin's Wharf. The night air was cold and sharp. The harbor was silent, save for the creaking of ships against the tide. One by one, the men boarded the vessels. They worked efficiently, almost ceremonially. Crates were broken open. Tea, thousands of pounds of it, was lifted and thrown into the dark water below. Splash after splash echoed through the harbor. No other cargo was touched. No crew members were harmed. Locks that were damaged were replaced. This was not chaos. It was controlled defiance. By the end of the night, 342 chests of tea lay dissolved in Boston Harbor, their contents carried away by the tide. The Boston Tea Party was over. At first, the city was eerily quiet. Then the reaction came, swift and explosive. In the colonies, news spread rapidly. For supporters of resistance, the act was bold and exhilarating. It proved that Americans were willing to move beyond words and petitions. The destruction of tea became a declaration. Parliament's authority would no longer be quietly tolerated. For loyalists and moderates, the event was terrifying. Property had been destroyed. Law had been openly defied. Many worried that the protest had gone too far, that it would invite harsh retaliation and plunge the colonies into chaos. Families argued. Communities divided. The line between patriot and loyalist sharpened. In London, outrage consumed Parliament. The Tea Party was viewed not as protest, but as rebellion. British leaders believed they had been patient, even generous. Now they felt mocked and challenged. If Boston could defy imperial authority without consequence, what would stop the rest of the empire from doing the same? The response was swift and unforgiving. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws the colonists would come to call the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Charter was altered, stripping the colony of self-governance. British officials accused of crimes were to be tried elsewhere. Troops could be quartered more easily in private homes. Boston was punished as a warning to all. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the punishment unified the colonies. Food and supplies poured into Boston from neighboring colonies. Letters of support arrived from distant towns. What Britain intended as discipline became solidarity. Colonists who had once felt disconnected now saw themselves bound by shared fate. The Boston Tea Party took on legendary status. It was remembered not just as an act of destruction, but as an assertion of dignity. Ordinary men had challenged the greatest empire in the world, and had done so deliberately, publicly, and together. The harbor became a symbol. Tea-stained water became a metaphor for irreversible change. The protest also marked a turning point in mindset. Before the Tea Party, many Americans still hoped for reconciliation. After it, that hope dimmed. Parliament's response made clear that compromise would come only through submission. Resistance, once cautious, grew determined. The Tea Party also revealed the power of collective action. No single leader ordered it, no army enforced it. It was carried out by neighbors who believed that certain lines once crossed could not be uncrossed. Authority had been challenged, not with weapons, but with resolve. In taverns and churches, the story was retold again and again. Children listened eye-wide as parents described the night tea vanished into the harbor. The act entered memory as proof that Americans could shape their own destiny. The empire had been challenged openly. The protest could no longer be ignored. The waters of Boston Harbor eventually cleared. Ships returned. Trade resumed cautiously. But nothing else returned to normal. The relationship between Britain and its colonies had fundamentally changed.
When news of the Boston Tea Party reached London, disbelief quickly turned into fury. To British leaders, the destruction of tea was not merely an act of protest, it was a direct challenge to imperial authority. Parliament had tolerated petitions, debates, and even boycotts, but this, they believed, was open rebellion. If Boston went unpunished, the empire itself would appear weak. The response was swift and unforgiving. In the spring of 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws designed to bring Massachusetts to heel. Officially, they were called the Coercive Acts. To the colonists who felt their weight, they became known by a different name, the Intolerable Acts. The message behind them was unmistakable. Obedience would be enforced, and defiance would be crushed. The first blow fell on Boston Harbor. The Port Act ordered the harbor closed until the East India Company had been fully compensated for the destroyed tea. Ships were barred from entering or leaving. Commerce, the lifeblood of the city, ground to a halt. Dock workers lost jobs overnight. Merchants watched their warehouses sit idle. Families who depended on maritime trade faced hunger and uncertainty. Boston was being strangled economically. Next came the Massachusetts Government Act, which struck at the heart of colonial self-rule. Town meetings were restricted. The colonial charter was altered to place power firmly in the hands of the royal governor. Officials were no longer chosen locally, but appointed by the crown. Decisions once made by neighbors were now dictated by distant authority. For many colonists, this act felt like the death of democracy. Justice, too, was reshaped. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in England or other colonies. To Americans, this signaled that imperial agents were now above the law. A soldier could harm a civilian and escape judgment by being removed from the community affected. Fear spread quickly. The Quartering Act added to that fear, permitting British troops to be housed in private buildings when necessary. Though often exaggerated in memory, the act symbolized intrusion. It reinforced the sense that colonial homes were no longer private sanctuaries, but subject to imperial needs.
each law tightened the chain. Parliament believed Massachusetts would be isolated. The punishment was intended as a lesson to remind all colonies of the cost of defiance. But British officials misunderstood the depth of colonial resentment. Instead of breaking resistance, the Intolerable Acts unified it. Sympathy for Boston surged. From New Hampshire to Georgia, colonists saw the punishment not as justice, but as tyranny. If Parliament could strip Massachusetts of its rights, no colony was safe. Neutral citizens, those who had once avoided political conflict, were drawn into the struggle by fear and empathy. Boston was no longer alone. Food and supplies flowed into the city from neighboring colonies. Farmers sent grain, merchants donated goods, churches organized relief. Acts of charity became acts of resistance. Supporting Boston meant defending the rights of all Americans. Political cooperation followed. Colonial leaders recognized that isolated protest was no longer enough. In September of 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They came with different backgrounds, priorities, and degrees of radicalism, but they shared a common purpose: to respond collectively to Britain's aggression. The Congress was cautious but firm. Delegates debated late into the night. Some hoped for reconciliation, others saw separation as inevitable. Together, they drafted petitions, declared colonial rights, and agreed on renewed boycotts of British goods. They also called for colonies to prepare militias, not for war, but for defense. The idea of unity began to take shape. In towns and villages, committees of correspondence expanded their reach. Information moved faster than ever. Ordinary citizens followed debates closely, discussing resolutions in taverns and churches. Politics was no longer the domain of elites, it belonged to everyone. Neutrality became harder to maintain. For many, the Intolerable Acts were a personal awakening. Farmers who had never seen Boston felt its pain. Shopkeepers who had avoided boycotts now participated. Ministers preached sermons linking resistance to moral duty. Even loyal subjects questioned whether loyalty demanded submission to injustice. British authority appeared increasingly rigid. Troops were sent to enforce the new laws. Fortifications were strengthened. Military governors assumed control. To the Crown, these measures restored order. To colonists, they confirmed fears of occupation. The gap between ruler and ruled widened further. Yet within this pressure, a sense of shared destiny emerged. Colonists began to see themselves not just as residents of separate provinces, but as members of a larger cause. The word liberty gained a sharper meaning. Rights once taken for granted were now understood as fragile and worth defending. The Intolerable Acts transformed protest into purpose. What had begun as opposition to taxation had evolved into a defense of self-governance. The question was no longer about tea or trade. It was about whether Americans could govern themselves or whether they would live at the mercy of distant power. Parliament had hoped to tighten control. Instead, it had tightened unity. The chains meant to bind the colonies together under the Crown instead bound them to one another. Punishment forged solidarity. Fear gave way to resolve. Neutral ground disappeared, replaced by difficult choices. As winter approached in 1774, the colonies stood at a crossroads. Reconciliation remained possible, but increasingly unlikely. The machinery of resistance was now in motion, driven by shared outrage and collective action.
By the spring of 1775, the American colonies stood on the edge of something irreversible. Years of petitions, protests, boycotts, and punishment had hardened attitudes on both sides of the Atlantic. Words had been exchanged endlessly, written in pamphlets, spoken in taverns, and preached from pulpits. But words, it seemed, were no longer enough. the British Empire prepared to assert control by force. In Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, the military governor, faced a growing challenge. Colonial militias, known as Minutemen, were drilling regularly. Weapons and gunpowder were being stored in towns outside Boston. Patriot leaders like Samuel Adams and John Hancock moved cautiously, aware that arrest could come at any moment. To British officials, this preparation bordered on rebellion. On the night of April 18, 1775, General Gage made his move. Approximately 700 British regulars were ordered to march from Boston to the nearby town of Concord. Their mission was clear: seize and destroy colonial military supplies before resistance could fully organize. Secrecy was essential, but the countryside was listening. As British troops quietly crossed the Charles River and began their march, colonial intelligence networks sprang into action. Riders mounted their horses and sped through the darkness, spreading warnings. Church bells rang, drums sounded, lanterns glowed in windows. The countryside awakened. The British are coming. By dawn on April 19th, the village of Lexington lay ahead. On the town green, a small group of colonial militiamen gathered: farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, and laborers. They were not professional soldiers. Their coats were worn, their muskets were old. Many had never fired a shot in anger. They had come not to start a war, but to show resolve. As the British column approached, tension filled the air. Captain John Parker, leader of the Lexington Militia, ordered his men to stand their ground, but not provoke violence. His command was simple: do not fire unless fired upon. The British troops halted. Officers shouted orders. Confusion rippled through both ranks. Then suddenly a single shot rang out. No one could later say with certainty who fired it or why, but the sound shattered the fragile restraint of the moment. British soldiers fired a volley. Smoke filled the green. When it cleared, 8 colonists lay dead or dying, and several others were wounded. The American Revolution had begun. The British troops continued their march to Concord, where they searched for military supplies. Most of the weapons had already been moved, hidden by local patriots. At the North Bridge, colonial militias gathered again, this time in greater numbers. They watched as British soldiers began to burn supplies and search buildings. Orders were given, shots were fired. This time, the colonists fired back. British soldiers fell. The regulars retreated across the bridge, stunned by the resistance they faced. What they had expected to be a routine operation was rapidly unraveling. As the British began their long march back to Boston, the countryside turned hostile. Militiamen poured in from surrounding towns. Farmers left their fields. Shopkeepers locked their doors. Ordinary men took up arms and moved toward the sound of gunfire. They did not fight in neat lines or open fields. They fired from behind trees, stone walls, and houses, using the land they knew as a weapon. The road back to Boston became a gauntlet. British soldiers, exhausted and low on ammunition, struggled to maintain formation. Every bend in the road brought new danger. Every village offered fresh resistance. By the time reinforcements arrived, British casualties had mounted far beyond expectations. The farmers had become fighters. News of the fighting spread like wildfire. Within days, thousands of militia surrounded Boston, laying siege to the city. The colonies were no longer merely protesting. They were resisting with force. Yet even then, many colonists hesitated to call it war. They spoke instead of defense, of protecting their homes and rights. Loyalty to the crown lingered uneasily beside the reality of bloodshed.
But the line had been crossed. Once shots were fired, history took its course. In Britain, the reaction was swift and shocked. Parliament declared Massachusetts in rebellion. Additional troops were ordered across the Atlantic. The Empire prepared for a conflict it had hoped to avoid, but no longer could. In the colonies, Lexington and Concord became legends almost immediately. Sermons described the fallen as martyrs. Pamphlets framed the battle as proof that tyranny would answer peaceful resistance with violence. The phrase, "the shot heard around the world," captured the moment's significance, not because the shot was loud, but because its echo would travel far beyond American shores. For ordinary Americans, everything had changed. A farmer who fired a musket that morning could no longer return to neutrality. A shopkeeper who supplied food to the militia had taken sides. Families faced difficult choices: support the cause, remain loyal, or try to survive quietly between two forces growing more hostile by the day. The revolution was no longer theoretical. It had names, faces, and graves. In the weeks that followed, colonial leaders moved quickly. The Second Continental Congress convened. Militias were reorganized into a Continental Army. George Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief, a choice meant to unify the colonies and lend legitimacy to the struggle. Still, uncertainty remained. The colonies lacked training, supplies, and unity of purpose. The British Empire possessed the world's most powerful military. Victory was far from guaranteed. But the events at Lexington and Concord had revealed something vital. Americans were willing to fight. Not for conquest, not for glory, but for the right to decide their own future. The road from protest to war had been long and contested. It had passed through laws and boycotts, speeches and sermons, tea-stained waters and closed harbors. At Lexington and Concord, it reached its breaking point.
In the early days of the American Revolution, victory was far from certain. The colonies had taken up arms against the most powerful empire in the world, yet they possessed no standing army, no unified command, and no guarantee of success. What they did possess was something far less measurable, but equally powerful: people willing to step forward, some into history, others into obscurity. The struggle for independence would be shaped not only by famous names, but by countless ordinary individuals whose courage, doubt, and sacrifice gave the revolution its human form. When the Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1775, its members understood the gravity of their situation. Armed conflict had begun, but leadership remained uncertain. The colonies needed a figure who could command respect, unite regional interests, and symbolize commitment to a common cause. Their choice fell on George Washington. Washington was not the most outspoken delegate, nor the most radical. He was, however, widely respected. A veteran of the French and Indian War, he understood both the realities of combat and the limitations of colonial forces. Tall, composed, and disciplined, Washington embodied restraint and resolve, qualities desperately needed in a fragile rebellion. When he accepted command of the Continental Army, Washington did so with humility and apprehension. He knew the army he inherited was poorly trained, badly supplied, and short-term in its commitments. Many soldiers enlisted for months, not years. Desertion was common. Discipline was uneven. Yet Washington believed that the army could be forged into a force capable of standing against British regulars. Leadership, he understood, would be as much about endurance as strategy. Around Washington stood other emerging leaders, each shaped by different experiences and temperaments. John Adams pushed relentlessly for independence, his sharp intellect and stubborn resolve driving debates forward.
Benjamin Franklin used wit and diplomacy to secure crucial foreign support. Thomas Paine ignited public spirit with words that cut through doubt and fear. Together, they formed a leadership that was imperfect, argumentative, and deeply human, but effective. Yet the revolution was not sustained by leaders alone. Across the countryside, ordinary men left their farms, workshops, and families to join militias and the Continental Army. They were not soldiers by profession. They were fathers, sons, brothers, men who understood the risks but felt compelled to act. For many, the decision was agonizing. Fighting meant abandoning crops that needed tending, businesses that required daily labor, and families that depended on their presence. It meant facing hunger, disease, and death. Doubt was constant. Letters home revealed fear, homesickness, and uncertainty. Yet, despite these struggles, they stayed, driven by a belief that their sacrifices mattered. Women, too, played essential roles. While rarely fighting on the battlefield, women sustained the war effort in countless ways. They managed farms and shops in the absence of husbands and sons. They produced clothing, cooked meals, and nursed the wounded. Some followed armies as camp followers, enduring harsh conditions alongside soldiers. Others served as messengers and spies, using their perceived invisibility to gather information. Their courage often went unrecorded, but without it, the revolution could not have survived. The early struggle also revealed moments of profound heroism from unexpected places. Militiamen stood their ground against trained soldiers. Communities sheltered fleeing patriots. Individuals risked imprisonment or execution for speaking out. Loyalty was tested daily, and choices carried heavy consequences. Not all heroes were confident. Fear shadowed every decision. Many questioned whether resistance was worth the cost. Loyalist neighbors warned of ruin. British victories reminded colonists of their vulnerability. Even Washington experienced doubt, writing privately of his fears that the army might collapse under pressure. Yet doubt did not paralyze action. It sharpened resolve. The contrast between British and American forces further shaped the struggle. British soldiers were disciplined, uniformed, and backed by resources. American fighters were irregular, diverse, and often poorly equipped, but they possessed familiarity with the land and a cause they believed deeply. This belief transformed ordinary people into symbols. Stories spread of small acts of bravery, of men holding lines longer than expected, of units standing firm despite overwhelming odds. These stories, whether fully accurate or embellished, fueled morale. They reminded Americans that they were capable of resisting an empire. Leadership also required moral clarity. Washington insisted on discipline and restraint, understanding that the revolution depended on legitimacy as much as victory. Civilians had to be protected. Prisoners had to be treated humanely. The army, he believed, must reflect the values it claimed to defend. This emphasis distinguished the revolutionary cause from mere rebellion. The early struggle forged a new understanding of leadership, one rooted not in birthright, but in service. Authority was earned through example. Respect followed sacrifice. This shift mirrored the broader transformation taking place within American society. As the war continued, legends began to form. Names would be remembered, monuments would be built, but behind every legend stood countless unnamed individuals whose contributions were as real. The revolution was not won by a single leader or battle, but by sustained commitment across years of hardship. Independence demanded patience, it demanded unity, and above all, it demanded people willing to act even when the outcome was uncertain. From Washington's steady command to the militiaman who fired a musket and returned to his plow, the early struggle for independence was shaped by human choices. Courage existed alongside fear. Hope lived beside doubt.
By the summer of 1776, The American colonies had already crossed many lines from which there could be no easy return. Blood had been shed at Lexington and Concord. An army had formed. A commander had been chosen. Yet one crucial question still lingered, heavy and unresolved. What exactly were they fighting for? Resistance alone was no longer enough. The colonies needed clarity, not just for themselves, but for the world. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia under a cloud of uncertainty. Delegates arrived carrying the weight of their colonies' fears and hopes. Some still clung to the possibility of reconciliation with Britain. Others believed independence was inevitable. All understood that whatever decision they made would alter history. Outside the chamber, war raged. British forces pressed the Continental Army, cities changed hands, supplies ran low, morale rose and fell with each report from the front. Inside the chamber, debate was intense, personal, and often painful. To declare independence was to accept treason in the eyes of the crown. Failure would bring imprisonment, exile, or death. No one took the decision lightly. Yet events had pushed the colonies toward a conclusion they could no longer avoid. King George III had rejected petitions. Parliament had escalated force. The British government had declared the colonies in rebellion. To many delegates, the message was unmistakable. The empire no longer saw Americans as partners, only as subjects to be subdued. The time had come to declare what they already felt. A committee was formed to draft a formal statement. Among its members were some of the sharpest minds in the colonies: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. The task before them was extraordinary. They were not merely announcing separation, they were explaining it, justifying it to their own people and to the world. The responsibility of writing fell largely to Jefferson. Jefferson was young, reserved, and deeply reflective. He drew upon Enlightenment philosophy, legal tradition, and the language of natural rights. Working in quiet isolation, he drafted words that would echo far beyond the moment of their creation. He began not with grievances, but with principles. We hold these truths to be self-evident. With that phrase, Jefferson anchored the Declaration not in British law, but in universal ideals: equality, natural rights, the belief that liberty was inherent, not granted by kings. Governments, he wrote, existed to secure these rights, and when they failed, the people had the right to alter or abolish them. These were dangerous ideas. They challenged centuries of political thought. They rejected the divine right of kings. They placed sovereignty not in a crown, but in the people themselves. For many delegates, these words were inspiring and terrifying. The Declaration did not stop at ideals. It laid out a detailed list of grievances against the king, accusations of tyranny, abuse of power, and violation of colonial rights. Each grievance was meant to justify the ultimate conclusion that separation was not reckless, but necessary. Debate over the draft was fierce. Delegates edited, argued, and compromised. Some language was softened, others sharpened. A passage condemning slavery was removed to preserve fragile unity among the colonies. The document that emerged was not perfect, but it was powerful. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted in favor of independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, the final text was approved. The United States of America declared itself into existence. The moment was quiet. No fireworks, no parades, just signatures on parchment and a shared understanding that nothing would ever be the same. The men who signed knew the cost. They pledged our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, fully aware that British victory would mean ruin. Courage once again took written form. When the Declaration was read publicly, its impact was immediate and electric. In Philadelphia, crowds gathered to hear the words spoken aloud. Bells rang, cheers erupted. The old symbols of monarchy were torn down. Across the colonies, copies were distributed and read in town squares, churches, and military camps. For soldiers, the Declaration clarified their purpose. They were no longer fighting merely to resist taxes or troops. They were fighting for independence, for the right to exist as a nation defined by ideals rather than obedience. The words gave meaning to sacrifice. They turned hardship into mission. For ordinary citizens, the Declaration was both empowering and unsettling. It promised equality, yet reality fell short. It spoke of liberty, yet slavery remained. It proclaimed rights that women and indigenous peoples would not fully enjoy for generations. Still, the Declaration planted a seed, one that would challenge Americans to live up to their own ideals. Internationally, the document carried immense weight. It signaled to foreign powers that the colonies sought recognition, not reform. France, long a rival of Britain, watched closely. The Declaration transformed the conflict from an internal rebellion into an international struggle, opening the door to alliances that would prove decisive. Britain, predictably, rejected it. To the Crown, the Declaration was treasonous propaganda. Military efforts intensified. The war entered a more dangerous phase. Independence, now declared, could only be secured through victory or lost forever through defeat. The Declaration did not end debate. Some colonists remained loyal to Britain. Others feared the chaos independence might bring. Communities were divided, families fractured. The promise of liberty came with profound uncertainty. Yet the act of declaring independence changed the nature of the struggle. It transformed 13 colonies into a single cause. It gave Americans a shared identity rooted in ideals rather than geography. The word American now meant something new, something political, aspirational, and bold. The Declaration also became a standard against which future generations would measure themselves. Its words would be quoted, challenged, expanded, and reinterpreted. Abolitionists would invoke it. Suffragists would demand inclusion. Civil rights leaders would echo its promise. What began as a revolutionary document became a moral compass, imperfect but enduring. In 1776, however, none of that was guaranteed. All that existed was a statement of belief and a willingness to fight for it. The ink had dried, but the future remained uncertain. Independence had been declared, but not yet secured. Still, something irreversible had occurred. A people had named themselves. They had defined liberty in their own terms. They had told the world who they believed they were and who they intended to become.
The Declaration of Independence had been signed, and the colonies had named themselves, but words alone could not secure liberty. Independence demanded action, endurance, and sacrifice. The struggle that followed would test the courage, endurance, and resilience of ordinary people and extraordinary leaders alike. Freedom, it became clear, was not a gift. It was a price to be paid in blood, sweat, and tears. From the moment the first shots rang out at Lexington and Concord, the colonies were engulfed in conflict. Farms and towns became battlefields. Families were uprooted. Cities were occupied. Soldiers marched for months with little rest, exposed to harsh weather, hunger, and disease. The realities of war were unrelenting, and the human cost mounted steadily. The Continental Army, under George Washington, faced overwhelming odds. British forces were well-trained, well-supplied, and battle-hardened. In contrast, the Americans were largely inexperienced, poorly equipped, and often short on food, clothing, and ammunition. At Valley Forge, the soldiers endured a winter that would become emblematic of sacrifice. Snow and frost-bitten limbs, hunger and disease tested morale as much as any battlefield. Yet through suffering, they emerged stronger, more disciplined, and more committed. Ordinary men proved the backbone of the revolution. Farmers left plows in the field, carpenters abandoned workshops, and merchants put their fortunes on the line.
Each musket fired, each march undertaken, and each camp endured was a contribution to something larger than any individual. They risked everything, lives, property, families, for an idea whose shape had been forged in taverns, churches, and the ink of the Declaration. Women, often overlooked in the annals of war, carried burdens equally heavy. They managed farms, tended to the wounded, supplied troops, and maintained the continuity of daily life under extraordinary strain. Some became messengers, spies, or nurses, walking dangerous paths with courage and ingenuity. Their labor, though often invisible, sustained the revolutionary effort. Without them, the armies could not have survived, nor the cause endured. The cost of revolution was measured in more than physical suffering. Families were torn apart, sometimes permanently. Communities were divided, with neighbors choosing opposing sides. Loyalists fled homes, while patriots faced imprisonment, fines, and execution. Fear was a constant companion. Every encounter with British troops could mean death, capture, or destruction. Every victory carried a shadow of loss. Major battles, Bunker Hill, Trenton, Saratoga, and Yorktown etched their mark on both the landscape and the psyche of the fledgling nation. Bunker Hill demonstrated the courage of militias against professional soldiers, even in defeat. Trenton restored hope after the dark winter at Valley Forge, showing that determination could overcome despair. Saratoga persuaded foreign allies to lend support, recognizing the resolve of Americans. Yorktown ultimately proved that persistence, strategy, and unity could defeat even the mightiest empire. Yet victory was never guaranteed. Many times the Continental Army came close to collapse. Supplies ran out, troops mutinied, desertion threatened cohesion, disease decimated ranks. Throughout these trials, leadership mattered as much as valor. Washington's steady presence, strategic foresight, and unwavering commitment kept the cause alive. Decisions made in council, on the battlefield, and in correspondence with allies shaped the trajectory of the struggle. The human cost extended beyond soldiers. Civilians suffered under occupation, raids, and skirmishes. Towns were burned, crops destroyed, and homes looted. Starvation, disease, and displacement afflicted men, women, and children. Patriot and loyalist alike experienced the cruel realities of war. The ideal of independence was inseparable from these human hardships. International support became essential to survival. France, Spain, and the Netherlands provided military aid, supplies, and funds. Diplomats worked tirelessly to secure alliances, demonstrating that the revolution was not only a local struggle, but a conflict with global implications. The contributions of foreign volunteers, soldiers, advisors, and financiers underscored the interconnectedness of the fight for liberty. Through hardship, Americans forged not only a new nation, but a new identity. Communities coalesced around shared ideals. Soldiers and civilians alike came to understand that the revolutionary struggle demanded collective action. Ordinary people, once distant from political decision-making, realized that their participation was vital. Liberty became a lived experience, not an abstract concept. Sacrifice was not measured solely in life or limb, but in endurance, moral fortitude, and perseverance. Families sacrificed comfort, security, and certainty. Leaders sacrificed reputation, personal safety, and sometimes principle for the greater good. Courage became both visible and invisible, in musket fire, in tending the sick, in persevering through hardship, in raising children amid chaos. The road to victory was long and fraught with uncertainty. Years of conflict, negotiation, and adaptation shaped the contours of freedom.
The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, finally confirmed the independence of the United States. But the treaty did not erase scars. Cities needed rebuilding, trade needed reestablishing, and society required reconciliation. The promise of independence now required the work of peace, governance, and unity. The foundations of the United States were forged through struggle and hope. Political institutions, codified laws, and the ideals articulated in foundational documents emerged from the crucible of war. Liberty was tested against not only British power, but against internal divisions, scarcity, and doubt. Through conflict, Americans learned the value of resilience, leadership, and civic responsibility. The Revolution left an enduring legacy. It taught that freedom demanded vigilance, that ideals without action were fragile, that courage was found in both leaders and ordinary citizens, and that the price of liberty was not paid once, but continually, through commitment to principle, willingness to sacrifice, and readiness to endure hardship. In the end, the human cost of the Revolution was staggering. Tens of thousands of lives lost, countless injuries, disrupted communities, and shattered economies marked the war. Yet these sacrifices were transformed into a lasting inheritance, the ability to govern, to aspire, and to define a society rooted in the belief that liberty was the birthright of every citizen. The story of the American Revolution is, at its heart, the story of people, leaders, legends, and ordinary heroes whose combined courage and perseverance brought forth a nation. Each battle, each hardship, each act of service and sacrifice was a link in the chain that connected struggle to hope, suffering to sovereignty, and aspiration to achievement. Freedom, they discovered, came at a cost, but that cost, paid through perseverance, courage, and unity, became the foundation upon which a new nation would rise. And in the echoes of musket fire, the endurance of winter camps, and the quiet acts of resilience in every town and home, the United States of America was born, not simply in declaration, but in struggle, sacrifice, and hope.